Yes. Dünya Anti-Imperialist Kadın Platformu Deklarasyonu. Anti-Imperialist ve NATO karşıtı mücadeleyi güçlendirelim. Kadınların toplumsal
Anti-NATO struggle and advance the social emancipation of women.
Üçüncü Dünya Savaşı, kadınların onurunu ve yaşamını ciddi biçimde tehdit
The flames of the World War III by imperialism are gravely threatening the dignity and lives of women. Women throughout the world are witnessing day by day the ugly, misogynistic reality of the imperialist aggressors who have long invoked women's rights as a overthrowing governments. On February 28, 2026, US imperialism and Israeli Zionists invaded Iran in West Asia. Along with the assassination of Iranian leaders, they bombed a girls' school in the Minab region, brutally killing 168 young school girls. This vivid example of the massacre of women is confirmed once again by the large-scale massacres in Palestine and Lebanon, where women and children.
Kadın hakları emperyalizmin Latin Amerika'yı yeniden sömürgeleştirmek amacıyla yürüttüğü
Women's rights also being trampled under the by imperialism to recolonize Latin America. The violations of the right to life and health caused by economic blockades and campaigns of isolation and suffocation imposed on the anti-imperialist governments of Latin America are reflected in the rising maternal mortality rates among women of childbearing age and the sharp in infant mortality. US imperialism slanders countries such as Venezuela and Colombia, which combat trafficking by branding them as drug cartels, while protecting the real drug cartels linked to the far-right forces in Miami and training for US.
Her zaman olduğu gibi bu güçlerin Latin Amerika
as always forces unleashed throughout Latin America are women.
Kadınlar olmaktadır. Bugün sahalde faaliyet gösteren teröristlerin büyük bölümü NATO ve emperyalist güçlerin 2011 yılında Libya'yı işgal ederek Muammar Kaddafi'nin
mercenaries who gathered after NATO and the imperialist powers
depolarını açmasının ardından bir araya gelen paralı
2011 overthrew the anti-imperialist government of Gaddafi and opened Pence depots. The imperialist occupation forces, including US Africa Command AFRICOM, manipulate these terrorists from behind the scenes, fomenting conflict and war within the anti-imperialist countries of the Sahel, while seeking to use attacks for renewed military intervention. This is precisely why Mali remains engulfed in civil war, as a result of armed conflicts and terrorist attacks, which claimed nearly 10,000 lives in the Sahel in 2025 alone. Women have been exposed to the most extreme dangers of abduction, forced marriage, and sexual rape. The brutality of the pro-United States fascist regimes and far-right armed groups in Africa are revealed by their weapon of war. As a vicious method of controlling the African terror and crushing their determination to wage imperialist resistance, they constantly commit horrific crimes against women and children, including abduction, sexual torture, and bodily mutilation. Women and imperialists suffer from low wage, resulting from the dual structure of the labor market in social welfare. This structurality is pervasive to all domains. White men are set at 180, while women of color only 60. The reality behind the welfare and freedom program and imperialist societies, the fundamental principle is exploitation. Make up a large share of are exposed to long working hours, wage theft, and sexual.
Emperyalizm kadınların düşmanıdır. Bunun merkezinde ise 3. Dünya Savaşı'nın askeri komutanlığı, savaş ve
unable even to report these abuses, becoming God women at NATO, the military command of the World War III, the machine of war, and the machine of massacre. Based on its long-standing strategy of aggression against the Soviet Union, continued
2025 Lahey
the
zirvesinde
prolongation of war in Ukraine and the
2026 Ankara zirvesinde
of war into
askeri
Eastern Europe.
harcamaların gayri safi yurt içi hasılanın
Summit
%5'ine çıkarılması ve Ukrayna'ya
used the
askeri
20 military
desteğin
spending
arttırılması
to
tartışılacaktır.
5% of GDP and expanding military support for Ukraine.
Girişimi çerçevesinde Katar, Birleşik Arap
Under the framework of the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, the four Gulf states, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Kuwait, were invited to Ankara.
İran üzerindeki baskıyı arttırdığı bir dönemde
Major
ABD yanlısı bu
member states such as Britain and France are exerting pressure on Iran under the ban of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. The participation of these pro-US Arab states in the summit signifies that NATO is preparing to intensify its military intervention against Iran. Having transformed artificial intelligence into an instrument of killing and reduced Eastern Europe and West Asia to testing grounds for advanced weapons, the military-industrial monopolies will, during the summit, discuss at defensive forum the conversion of civilian manufacturing industries into military production. At the same time, work the way to standardize and integrate according to produced by pro-US subordinate states operating under the guise of allies, including the Republic of Korea, Rogue, and Japan. NATO intends to place these weapons in the hands of the Ukrainian neo-Nazi forces while drawing pro-imperialist states in Indo-Pacific into subordinate military system, thereby the region into a new war place. A human's liberation struggles, the goal of anti-imperialism, is an expression of imperialist domination, division, and reformism. It's a bourgeois ideology that lets their primary enemies, whilst it presents social inequality, biological inequality, and reduces women to objects that need to be saved. A vicious economic strategy that was the condition of women in order to reinforce imperial domination. Such practices constitute one of the concrete manifestations of the colonial strategy of divide and rule, which has continued from the era of old colonialism to the present day. In reality, imperialism preserves and actively exudes in order to strengthen its colonial domination, and at the present stage, the foremost enemy of women's struggle for emancipation is imperialism and NATO. In the face of NATO's expanding aggression and its deepening threat, women and of people must strengthen the anti-NATO struggle by intensifying the worldwide movement to dismantle US and NATO military bases. Thousands of against women occur every year. Yet because of extraterritorial privileges and other unequal agreements that place foreign troops above, not a single member of US or NATO forces has been properly held accountable. The problem of the sexual exploitation by foreign troops differs little in substance from what it was a century ago, until its forms have changed while the systematic violation of human rights continues unabated. Today, the military exercises aggressive war conducted from US and NATO bases constitute an objective condition and an ever-present threat that will at any moment be turned into victims of war.
Anti-emperyalizm ve bağımsızlık yaşamın ve barışın yoludur. Emperyalizm ve bağımlılık ise
anti-imperialism and independence is a way to life, and imperialism and subordination are the road to death and war. The women of West Asia are a determined struggle to defend anti-imperialist liberation and the dignity of women against the overlapping oppression and violence of imperialism, Zionism, and pro-United States Islamic forces. Women throughout the world refuse to bow before the brutal threats of pro-imperialist fascist regimes and pro-US neoliberal governments, rising instead in anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, and anti-fascist struggle. Women living in the imperialist likewise move resisting labor in it and women indoctrination disguised as feminism. From the past to the present, women have proudly formed one of the principal forces of the anti-imperialist struggle and one of the central pillars of the revolutionary movement. Since the 20th century, women have in the struggles for national liberation against imperialism, in the construction of a new society, and today on every front of struggle. Under the acute conditions of the World War III being driven forward by NATO, the machinery of war, women will strengthen international unity and fight resolutely to the very end against every trial and obstacle and its fascist servants. Along the magnificent historical path of liberation, class liberation, and human liberation, women will always advance as the masters of liberation and the masters of their own task, powerfully to Jin Jian Azadi, life down imperialism, dismantle NATO forces stationed throughout the world, women of the world unite and July 5, 2026 World Anti-Imperialist Platform.